The mountain groaned like a dying giant. Dust spiraled through fractured beams, turning the air into a suffocating fog. Somewhere beneath the collapsed rock and twisted metal, a sound cut through the silence. A low, deliberate scratch. Then another, and another. The rescue dog froze mid-step, ears rigid, body trembling with focus. His handler dropped to one knee, pressing a gloved hand against the cold stone. The scratching stopped. For 3 long seconds, the world held its breath. Then the dog lunged forward, claws scraping frantically at a section of wall that looked no different from the rest. The handler's radio crackled. "What have you got?" But the dog didn't wait for permission. He dug and dug until his paw broke through something soft, something warm, something that shouldn't have been there. What he uncovered wasn't just a survivor. It was a man the world had already buried. The valley had always been a place of depth, not just the kind measured in feet and meters, but the kind that pressed down on the chest, that turned voices into whispers, that made every conversation feel like a confession. The mining town of Greyridge sat at the base of the eastern range, a cluster of homes built from timber and stubbornness, where smoke rose from chimneys even in summer, and the scent of coal clung to every jacket, every doorframe, every goodbye. The mine itself was older than most of the men who worked it. Shafts carved into the mountain decades ago, reinforced with timber that had started to rot, metal that had started to rust. But it was work, and work was sacred here. Captain Marcus Hale had been part of the regional fire and rescue division for 11 years. Tall, broad-shouldered, with hands that bore the scars of 1,000 emergencies, he moved through the world with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned not to waste motion. His uniform was always clean, his boots always laced, his radio always clipped to his chest. But it was the dog at his side that made people stop and stare. Flint, a 3-year-old Belgian Malinois with a coat the color of burnt caramel and eyes that seemed to see through walls. Flint had been trained in urban search and rescue, wilderness tracking, and disaster recovery. He could detect a human heartbeat from 30 feet away. He could differentiate between the living and the dead. And he never ever gave a false alert. Marcus had adopted him from a handler who'd retired after a career-ending injury. The first time Marcus threw a training dummy into a pile of rubble, Flint had it back in 40 seconds. The second time, Marcus buried it under 2 feet of dirt. Flint found it in less than a minute. By the 3rd week, Marcus stopped testing him. Flint didn't need tests, he needed purpose, and Marcus gave him that. The morning of the quake, the sky had been pale and cloudless. Marcus had been at the station filling out incident reports when the ground beneath him rolled like a wave. The building groaned. Coffee spilled across the desk. Flint shot to his feet, ears flat, eyes wide. The tremor lasted 12 seconds, but in those 12 seconds the mountain split. The main shaft of the Greyridge mine collapsed inward, swallowing steel and stone and 63 men into a darkness that swallowed sound itself. By the time Marcus reached the site, the entrance was a crater. Dust hung in the air like fog. Families had already begun to gather, mothers, wives, children standing in clusters, eyes fixed on the mountain as if staring hard enough could pull their loved ones back. The regional command center was set up within the hour. Engineers arrived with blueprints. Medics set up triage tents. Rescue teams fanned out across the surface, marking potential entry points, testing air quality, listening for vibrations. Marcus and Flint were assigned to the northern perimeter, where a secondary access tunnel had partially survived. The entrance was narrow, unstable, littered with fallen beams and fractured rock. Marcus clipped a headlamp to his helmet. Flint pressed close to his leg, waiting. The command came through the radio. "Search and assess. No heroics, report back in 30. Marcus nodded. Flint's tail twitched once. They stepped into the dark. The tunnel smelled of wet stone and something older, something that had been buried long before the quake. Marcus's headlamp cut through the blackness in a narrow cone, illuminating walls that glistened with moisture. The air was cold, too cold. His breath fogged in front of him. Behind him, Flint moved with precision, nose low, body tense. Every few steps the dog paused, testing the air, ears swiveling like radar dishes. Marcus had learned to trust those pauses. They weren't random. They were data. 10 minutes in, Flint stopped. His body went rigid, ears forward, tail stiff. Marcus knelt beside him, scanning the walls. Nothing, just rock and shadow. "What is it, boy?" Flint didn't move. His gaze was locked on a section of wall to their left, a place where the stone seemed darker, rougher, as if it had been disturbed recently. Marcus ran his gloved hand across the surface. Cold, uneven, and then he felt it. A seam, not natural, not old, fresh. Someone had sealed this section recently. Why? Marcus pressed his ear to the stone. Silence. No vibration, no airflow. He straightened, ready to move on, but Flint didn't budge. The dog's breathing had changed. Faster, shallower. His paw lifted, hovered, then scraped once against the wall. Deliberate, purposeful. Marcus's pulse quickened. "You sure?" Flint pawed again, harder. Marcus pulled the radio from his belt. "Command, this is Hale. Flint's got something. Sector 7, North Tunnel. Possible concealed chamber." Static, then a voice. "Can you confirm?" Marcus looked down at Flint. The dog's eyes were locked on the wall, unblinking. "Confirmed. Requesting clearance to breach." A pause. "Negative. Hold position. Structural team en route." Marcus clipped the radio back. Flint whined, low, urgent. Marcus had heard that sound before. It wasn't frustration. It wasn't impatience. It was certainty. Someone was behind that wall, and they were alive. Minutes crawled by like hours. Marcus paced the narrow corridor, eyes flicking between his watch and the sealed wall. Flint sat perfectly still, gaze fixed, body coiled. The structural team arrived 20 minutes later. 2 engineers with scanning equipment, hard hats and skepticism etched into their faces. The older one, a man named Garrett with a graying beard and tired eyes, approached the wall with a handheld sensor. He pressed it against the stone, watched the readout, frowned. "There's a void," he said. "Small, maybe 8 by 10 feet. Could be a natural fissure. Or a room," Marcus said. Garrett glanced at Flint. "Your dog sure about this?" Flint's tail twitched. "He's sure," Marcus said. Garrett sighed. "All right, we'll open it, but slowly. If this section's unstable, we could bring the whole tunnel down." He signaled to his partner, who began setting up a pneumatic drill. The sound was deafening in the confined space, a high-pitched shriek that made Marcus's teeth ache. Flint pressed against his leg, ears flat, but eyes still locked on the wall. The drill bit into stone. Dust billowed. The wall cracked, spider-webbed, and then, with a sound like breaking ice, a section the size of a dinner plate gave way. Cold air rushed out. Garrett leaned in with a flashlight, stopped, swore. "What is it?" Marcus asked. Garrett didn't answer. He just stepped back, face pale, and gestured for Marcus to look. Marcus moved to the opening, shone his light inside. The chamber was small, as Garrett had said, but it wasn't empty. There was a cot, a blanket, a kerosene lamp, and sitting against the far wall, knees drawn to his chest, face streaked with dirt and tears, was a man. He was maybe 40, rail-thin, with hollowed cheeks and eyes that looked too large for his skull. His hands were wrapped in filthy bandages. His breathing was shallow, ragged, and when the light hit him, he flinched like he'd been struck. "Jesus," Garrett whispered. Marcus spoke into the opening, voice calm, steady. "Sir, can you hear me? We're here to help." The man didn't respond, didn't move, just stared at the light with an expression that was equal parts terror and relief. Flint pushed past Marcus, squeezing through the opening before anyone could stop him. He crossed the chamber in 3 strides and sat beside the man, close but not touching. The man's gaze shifted to the dog. His lips trembled, and then for the first time he spoke. I thought no one would come." His voice was a rasp, broken, barely audible. Marcus widened the opening with his hands, ignoring the sharp edges that bit into his gloves. "We're getting you out. Just stay calm. What's your name?" The man's eyes filled. Daniel Ortiz." "How long have you been in here, Daniel?" The man's head dropped. "I don't know, days, maybe a week, I lost count." Garrett muttered into his radio, calling for medical support. Marcus kept his eyes on Daniel. "Were you working in the mine when the quake hit?" Daniel shook his head, slowly, painfully. "No, I was already here." Marcus's chest tightened. "Already here? What do you mean?" Daniel's hands began to shake. "I didn't have a choice. They put me here. They said I couldn't leave." The words hung in the air like smoke. Garrett stopped mid-transmission. Marcus's pulse spiked. "Who put you here?" Daniel's voice cracked. "The foreman and 2 others. They said I knew too much. They said if I talked, they'd make sure I never saw my family again." His breathing hitched, broke. "So they locked me in, and when the quake came, they left me." The medics arrived within minutes, but extracting Daniel took over an hour. The opening had to be widened carefully. the surrounding rock reinforced with steel bracing to prevent further collapse. Daniel was conscious but barely coherent, his body weakened by dehydration and shock. Flint stayed beside him the entire time, pressed against his leg like a living anchor. When they finally pulled him out, wrapped in a thermal blanket and strapped to a stretcher, the crowd that had gathered outside the tunnel fell silent. Faces twisted with confusion, then anger, then something darker. Marcus overheard the whispers. "That's Ortiz, he worked maintenance. Wasn't he let go last month?" "No, he quit. Said something about the safety inspections being faked." "Jesus! You think they—" "Quiet. Not here." Marcus followed the stretcher to the medical tent, Flint at his side. Inside, the lead paramedic, a sharp-eyed woman named Torres, checked Daniel's vitals and started an IV. His blood pressure was dangerously low. His hands, when unwrapped, revealed deep lacerations and signs of prolonged restraint. Torres looked at Marcus. "This wasn't an accident." "I know," Marcus said. "He said he was locked in by the foreman and 2 others." Torres's jaw tightened. "We need to report this. Now." Marcus nodded. "Already done. Sheriff's on his way." But even as he said it, a knot formed in his gut. Because if Daniel was telling the truth, if he'd been imprisoned to silence him, then the quake hadn't just been a natural disaster. It had been a convenient cover, and whoever had sealed him inside that chamber had done so knowing full well he might never be found. Sheriff Carver arrived an hour later, a stocky man with graying temples and a face that had seen too many ugly truths. He spoke with Daniel briefly, then pulled Marcus aside. He says the foreman, Ron Mackey, and 2 supervisors locked him in after he threatened to report falsified safety logs. Said the mine's been operating with faulty equipment for months. Mackey told him to keep quiet or disappear. Marcus's blood went cold. And then the quake hit. Carver nodded grimly. "Convenient, isn't it? Bury the whistleblower under a few thousand tons of rock, blame it on nature, move on." "Where's Mackey now?" "Don't know, haven't seen him since the collapse. Could be trapped inside with the others. Could be long gone." Marcus's fists clenched. "We need to find him." "We will," Carver said. "But first, we need to keep Daniel alive long enough to testify." Over the next 48 hours, the rescue operation intensified. 7 miners were pulled from collapsed sections alive. 11 were found dead. 34 remained missing. The media descended on Greyridge like locusts, cameras and microphones crowding the perimeter, reporters shouting questions at exhausted workers. But the story that captured the most attention wasn't the mine collapse itself. It was Daniel Ortiz, the man who'd been left to die, the man who'd been silenced, the man who, against all odds, had been found by a dog with an instinct sharper than any machine. Marcus gave a brief statement to the press, keeping his tone measured, professional. He didn't mention the accusations against Mackey. Not yet. That was for the sheriff to handle. But the reporters smelled blood. They dug. They interviewed former workers. They found emails, memos, photos of cracked beams and rusted equipment. Within a day, the story exploded. Mining company ignored safety warnings for months. Whistleblower sealed in chamber before quake. Rescue dog uncovers corporate cover-up. The company issued a statement denying all wrongdoing. Mackey's lawyer claimed his client was trapped inside the mine and couldn't defend himself, but no one believed it. Not anymore. Daniel, still recovering in the hospital, gave a full deposition. He described the months of falsified reports, the pressure from upper management to keep operations running despite failing infrastructure, the threats made against him when he tried to go public. He named names, provided dates, showed the scars on his wrists where the zip ties had cut into his skin. The district attorney opened a criminal investigation. Warrants were issued, and 3 days after the rescue, Ron Mackey was found, not trapped in the mine, not dead, but in a motel 200 miles away, with a suitcase full of cash and a one-way ticket to another country. He was arrested without incident, charged with false imprisonment, reckless endangerment, and conspiracy. 2 supervisors were picked up the following day. The mining company's CEO resigned under pressure. The board announced an independent audit, and slowly, painfully, the truth began to surface. The courtroom was packed. Families of the miners sat in the front rows, faces drawn, eyes red. Daniel sat at the witness stand, thinner than before but steady, his hands folded in his lap. Marcus was in the gallery, Flint lying quietly at his feet. The prosecutor stood. "Mr. Ortiz, can you describe what happened on the day you were sealed inside the chamber?" Daniel's voice was soft but clear. "I had collected evidence, photos of cracked support beams, copies of inspection reports that had been altered. I went to the foreman, Ron Mackey, and told him I was taking it to the State Regulatory Board. He told me to think about my family, to think about what could happen if I made a mistake. He paused, swallowed. 2 days later, he called me into the maintenance office, said there was a problem in one of the lower tunnels. When I got there, 2 supervisors were waiting. They grabbed me, tied my hands, dragged me into a storage chamber that had been carved out years ago. Mackey said I'd stay there until I learned to keep my mouth shut. He said no one would look for me, that if I disappeared, people would just assume I'd quit. His voice cracked. Then the quake hit, and I heard them run. I heard the walls start to crack. I screamed. I pounded on the door, but they didn't come back. Silence filled the room. The prosecutor nodded slowly. "And how long were you in that chamber?" "I don't know, days, maybe 5, maybe 6. I had a little water, no food. I thought I was going to die in there." And then, Daniel's eyes found Marcus in the crowd, found Flint. Then I heard scratching and barking, and light broke through the wall, and I realized someone had come, someone had found me. His voice broke. "That dog saved my life." The defense tried to argue that Daniel had been temporarily confined for his own safety, that the quake was an unforeseeable event, that Mackey had intended to release him, but the evidence was overwhelming. The falsified reports, the testimony of other workers, the injuries on Daniel's wrists. The prosecutor played a recording, an audio file recovered from Daniel's phone, taken weeks before the quake, in which Mackey explicitly threatened him. "You talk, you disappear." Simple as that. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty, on all counts. Mackey was sentenced to 15 years. The supervisors got 8 each. The mining company was fined millions and forced into bankruptcy. And Daniel, finally, was free. The months that followed were quieter. The mine remained closed. The town slowly rebuilt. Families grieved. Others moved away. But some stayed. Because staying meant remembering. And remembering meant honoring the men who had been lost. A memorial was erected at the base of the mountain. A wall of polished granite engraved with 63 names. Families came every week to leave flowers, to run their fingers over the letters, to whisper words meant only for the dead. Daniel returned home. His wife held him like she was afraid he'd vanish again. His 2 daughters clung to his legs and cried. He started therapy, began to sleep without nightmares, found work as a safety consultant, traveling to mines across the region, teaching workers to recognize danger, to speak up, to refuse to be silenced. He carried a photo in his wallet, a picture of himself standing beside Marcus and Flint, taken the day he was released from the hospital. On the back, in his wife's handwriting, were 3 words: "You were found." Marcus returned to his regular duties: fires, car accidents, missing hikers. But he noticed something different in Flint. The dog was more focused, more deliberate, as if the rescue had sharpened something inside him. One evening, Marcus knelt beside him in the station, scratching behind his ears. "You knew, didn't you? You knew he was there before anyone else did." Flint's tail thumped once. Marcus smiled. "Good boy." 6 months after the rescue, the regional fire department held an awards ceremony. Marcus was given a commendation for bravery and leadership. The mayor gave a speech. Families applauded. But it was the moment when Daniel walked onto the stage, holding a custom-made medal, that the room fell silent. He knelt in front of Flint, fastened the medal around the dog's neck, and whispered something no one else could hear. Flint's tail wagged. Slow, steady. The room erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. But Marcus wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at Daniel, at the way his shoulders had straightened, at the way his eyes, once hollow, now held light again. And he realized something. Rescue wasn't just about pulling people from rubble. It was about pulling them back from the edge of despair, about showing them that even when the world tried to bury them, someone would dig, someone would search, someone would refuse to give up. Sometimes the most dangerous traps aren't made of stone. They're made of silence, of fear, of lies told by people in power who believe they're untouchable. But silence can be broken, fear can be overcome, and lies, no matter how deep they're buried, can be uncovered by those who refuse to stop searching. Flint didn't understand corruption. He didn't understand corporate greed or falsified reports, but he understood one thing with absolute clarity. There was a human behind that wall, and that human needed help. So he scratched, and he pawed, and he didn't stop until the truth came to light. In the end, the real rescue wasn't just Daniel's, it was the entire town's. Because once the truth emerged, the fear lifted. The silence broke, and the people who had been too afraid to speak found their voices again. They demanded accountability, they demanded change, and they got it. All because a dog refused to walk past a wall that everyone else had ignored. Loyalty doesn't calculate risk. Love doesn't wait for permission. And sometimes, the smallest act of persistence can bring down the heaviest walls. Heroes don't always wear badges. Sometimes they have 4 paws, a wet nose, and a heart that beats only for the mission. Find the lost. Protect the vulnerable. Never, ever give up. The mountain still stands. The town still breathes. And somewhere in the quiet hours of the night, when the wind moves through the valley and the stars press close, you can hear it. The sound of a dog's claws against stone. The sound of a man's tears turning into hope. The sound of a truth too powerful to stay buried. That sound is what rescue really means. Not the moment of extraction, but the moment when someone realizes they were never forgotten, that someone kept searching, that someone refused to let them disappear. And in that moment, the darkness loses. Every single time. The story of Daniel Ortiz and Flint didn't end with the courtroom verdict. It spread, first through local news, then regional broadcasts, then national coverage. Documentaries were made. Podcasts dissected the case. Advocacy groups used Daniel's story as a rallying cry for stronger labor protections and whistleblower safeguards. The phrase, "buried alive by greed," became shorthand for corporate negligence, and at the center of it all was a single image. A man kneeling beside a dog, both exhausted, both alive, both proof that sometimes the system fails, but people don't have to. Marcus began receiving calls from other jurisdictions. Departments wanted to know how Flint had been trained, what protocols had been followed, how they could replicate that level of precision in their own rescue operations. Marcus answered every question patiently, but he always circled back to the same point. You can train the skills, but you can't train the instinct. Flint didn't find Daniel because of a manual. He found him because he refused to accept that no one was there. That refusal, Marcus explained, was what separated good search dogs from great ones. The willingness to push past the obvious, to trust their senses over human assumptions, to dig when logic said stop. It was a lesson Marcus had learned the hard way. Early in his career, he'd been part of a search that ended in failure. A missing hiker, presumed lost in the wilderness. The search team had scoured the area for days, then called it off. 2 weeks later, a group of campers found the hiker's body less than a mile from the search zone. Marcus never forgot that. Never forgave himself for stopping too soon. Flint had given him a second chance, not to undo the past, but to honor it by never repeating the mistake. Daniel, meanwhile, became an unlikely advocate. He spoke at conferences, testified before legislative committees, met with miners' unions and safety inspectors. His message was simple. Speak up before it's too late. Don't wait until you're the one sealed behind a wall. He shared his story not for sympathy, but as a warning. Because he knew there were others like him, workers who saw problems and stayed silent out of fear, managers who prioritized profit over safety, systems designed to protect power rather than people, and he refused to let his suffering be for nothing. If his story could prevent even one person from being silenced, it was worth reliving the nightmare every time he stepped in front of a microphone. His family adjusted slowly. His wife, Maria, attended therapy with him. Their daughters learned to recognize when he needed space, when the memories pressed too close. They planted a garden in their backyard. Tomatoes, peppers, herbs, something Daniel could tend with his hands, something that grew instead of crumbled. On bad days, when the walls seemed to close in, he would sit among the plants and breathe. In, out, slowly, until the panic receded. Maria would bring him water. The girls would sit beside him, quiet, present, and eventually he would smile. Small, fragile, but real. Those moments became the foundation of his recovery, not grand gestures or dramatic breakthroughs, but tiny, repeated acts of normalcy. Proof that life could be more than survival, that it could be gentle, that it could be whole again. Flint's ability to detect Daniel through solid rock became a subject of scientific inquiry. Researchers from a university 2 states over reached out to Marcus, asking if they could study Flint's olfactory capabilities. Marcus agreed, on the condition that the research be non-invasive and that Flint continue his regular duties. The team set up controlled experiments. They sealed volunteers inside chambers similar to the one Daniel had been trapped in, varying the thickness of the walls, the ventilation, the time elapsed. Flint passed every test. Not once did he give a false alert. Not once did he miss a target. The researchers were stunned. They published a paper detailing their findings. Under optimal conditions, a trained detection dog could sense human scent through barriers up to 18 inches thick, provided there was even minimal airflow. But Flint's case exceeded those parameters. The wall had been nearly 2 feet thick, the airflow negligible. Yet he'd alerted within minutes. The lead researcher, Dr. Amelia Chu, hypothesized that Flint wasn't just detecting scent in the traditional sense. He was detecting a combination of factors: micro-vibrations from breathing, changes in air pressure, even the faint electromagnetic field generated by a living body. "Dogs perceive the world in ways we're only beginning to understand," she explained in an interview. "Flint didn't just smell Daniel, he sensed him, and that distinction might be what saved his life." The paper was cited in training manuals worldwide. Flint became something of a legend in the search and rescue community. But Marcus never let it go to the dog's head. "He's still the same goofball who steals socks and begs for bacon," Marcus told a reporter. "He just happens to be really good at his job." Not every story from the Greyridge collapse had a happy ending. Of the 63 men initially trapped, only 19 survived. The rest were recovered in the weeks and months that followed, their bodies brought to the surface with reverence and grief. Funerals stretched across the calendar. The town's single cemetery ran out of space. A new section had to be consecrated. Marcus attended as many services as he could. He stood in the back, uniform pressed, hat in hand, and listened as families remembered fathers, brothers, sons. He heard the same words over and over. He loved this work. He provided for us. He didn't deserve this. And every time, Marcus felt the weight of it. The knowledge that for every Daniel he found alive, there were dozens he couldn't save. It was the math of disaster, the cruel arithmetic that no training could overcome. But he didn't let it paralyze him, because if he did, the next person who needed help wouldn't get it. So, he carried the grief, let it sharpen his focus, used it as fuel. One family in particular stayed with him, the Morenos, a widow named Clara and her 3 sons, the youngest only 6. Her husband, Javier, had been a shift supervisor, a good man by all accounts, kind, hard-working. He'd been near the entrance when the quake hit, trying to evacuate others. He never made it out. Clara came to Marcus a week after the funeral, her boys clutching her skirt. She thanked him for trying, for searching, for not giving up, even when the odds were impossible. Marcus didn't know what to say. He wanted to apologize, to explain that he'd done everything he could, but the words felt hollow, so he just nodded. And when the youngest boy asked if he could pet Flint, Marcus said yes. The boy buried his face in Flint's fur and cried. Flint didn't move, didn't pull away, just stood there solid and warm, while the boy's small body shook. Clara put a hand on Marcus's arm. "Thank you," she whispered, "for being here, for remembering." Marcus's throat tightened. "I won't forget." And he didn't. He kept a photo of Javier on his office wall, a reminder, a promise, to keep searching, to keep trying, to honor the ones who didn't make it home by never giving up on the ones who still could. The relationship between Marcus and Flint deepened in the aftermath of the rescue. They'd always been a strong team, but the Greyridge operation had forged something closer to symbiosis. Marcus learned to read Flint's body language with near-perfect accuracy. A certain tilt of the head meant uncertainty. A stiffening of the spine meant alert. A low whine meant urgency. And Flint, in turn, learned to anticipate Marcus's needs. When Marcus's stress levels spiked, signaled by shorter breaths, tighter movements, Flint would press against his leg, grounding him. When Marcus worked late, lost in paperwork or incident reports, Flint would nudge his hand, reminding him to eat, to sleep, to step away from the desk. They communicated in a language beyond words, a language of presence, of trust, of mutual reliance. Marcus took Flint everywhere, not just on calls, but to the grocery store, to the park, to the occasional barbecue with friends. People always wanted to approach, to pet the famous rescue dog, to hear the story firsthand. Marcus allowed it, but only when Flint was off duty. When the vest was on, Flint was working. No distractions, no exceptions. But when the vest came off, Flint transformed. The intense focus softened into playfulness. He'd chase tennis balls until his tongue lolled, roll in the grass, flop onto his back for belly rubs. It was important, Marcus knew, for Flint to have that balance, to be more than a tool, to be a dog, because the work they did was heavy. It took a toll, and if Flint couldn't decompress, the weight would eventually crush him. Marcus saw it happen to other handlers, dogs who burned out, who developed anxiety, who started giving false alerts because they were desperate to please their handler, even when there was nothing to find. Marcus refused to let that happen to Flint, so he scheduled downtime, took vacations, played games that had nothing to do with work, and he paid attention to Flint's appetite, his sleep patterns, his energy levels, because a rescue dog wasn't just a piece of equipment. He was a partner, a friend, a living being with needs and limits and emotions, and Marcus would be damned if he let the job break him. The changes that followed the Greyridge disaster were systemic. New laws were passed. Inspections became mandatory and unannounced. Whistleblower protections were strengthened. Mining companies faced harsher penalties for safety violations. The industry fought back, of course, lobbied, filed lawsuits, claimed the new regulations were too costly, would kill jobs, would devastate small operations. But public opinion had shifted. The image of Daniel Ortiz, thin and trembling, standing beside a dog who'd refused to let him die, was too powerful to ignore. Politicians who opposed the reforms found themselves on the defensive. Protesters gathered outside corporate headquarters. Shareholders demanded accountability, and slowly, grudgingly, the industry began to change, not out of altruism, but out of necessity, because the alternative was worse. Other industries took note. Construction companies reviewed their safety protocols. Chemical plants hired independent auditors. Warehouses installed better ventilation and emergency exits. It wasn't perfect. Corners were still cut. Rules were still bent. But the bar had been raised, and every time a worker raised a concern, every time an inspector flagged a violation, Daniel's story was there. A reminder that silence could be deadly, that loyalty to the truth mattered more than loyalty to the paycheck, that one person armed with courage and evidence could topple an empire of negligence, and that sometimes the smallest voice, the one everyone tried to bury, was the one that echoed the loudest. Daniel received letters, hundreds of them, from workers who'd been silenced, from families who'd lost loved ones to preventable accidents, from advocates who'd been fighting for years without traction. They thanked him, told him he'd given them hope, told him his courage had inspired them to keep pushing. Daniel read every letter, responded to as many as he could, and on the days when the weight of it all felt too heavy, when he wondered if it had been worth it, he would reread those letters, and he would remember he hadn't just survived, he'd sparked something, a movement, a shift, a refusal to accept that profit mattered more than people, and that was worth every nightmare, every scar, every moment of terror in that dark, sealed chamber. A year after the rescue, the town of Greyridge held a remembrance ceremony. The memorial wall had been completed, engraved with the names of the men who'd died. Families gathered, speeches were given, candles were lit, and at the end, Marcus and Flint were invited to the stage. The mayor presented Marcus with a plaque for extraordinary bravery and dedication in the face of unimaginable adversity. The crowd applauded. Marcus nodded, shook hands, accepted the plaque with humility. But when it was Flint's turn, something unexpected happened. Daniel stepped onto the stage. He was stronger now, healthier. His face had filled out. His eyes were clear. He carried a small wooden box, hand-carved, polished to a soft gleam. He knelt in front of Flint, opened the box, and pulled out a leather collar. It was custom-made, dyed a deep bronze with a single engraved plate. Flint, hero, finder of the lost. Daniel fastened the collar around Flint's neck. The dog sat perfectly still, tail wagging slowly. Daniel's hands trembled. His voice cracked. "You didn't just find me," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "You gave me my life back. You gave my wife her husband, my daughters their father. You didn't know me, didn't owe me anything, but you dug anyway, and I will never, ever forget that." He wrapped his arms around Flint's neck. The dog leaned into him. The crowd was silent. And then, one by one, people began to clap, softly at first, then louder, until the entire gathering was on its feet, applauding a dog who'd done what humans couldn't, refused to give up, refused to walk away, refused to let a life be erased. Marcus's eyes burned. He blinked hard. Flint's tail thumped against the stage, and for a moment the grief that hung over the town lifted, just a little, just enough to let the light in. Years later, Marcus would look back on the Greyridge rescue as the defining moment of his career, not because it was the most dramatic, not because it garnered the most attention, but because it crystallized everything he believed about the work, about loyalty, about persistence, about the quiet, stubborn refusal to accept defeat. He would tell new recruits, "You can teach someone to read a map, to operate a radio, to stabilize a patient, but you can't teach someone to care enough to search when everyone else has stopped. That's not a skill, that's a calling." And Flint, growing older now, his muzzle flecked with grey, would lie beside him during those talks, eyes half closed, content. He'd earned his rest, earned the right to slow down, but every so often, when a call came through the radio, his ears would perk, his body would tense, and Marcus would know the instinct was still there, the drive, the unshakable certainty that somewhere, someone needed help, and that he, Flint, would find them. Daniel continued his work as a safety consultant. He remarried, not literally but emotionally. He and Maria renewed their vows on their 20th anniversary, surrounded by family and friends in a small ceremony that felt like a rebirth. His daughters grew, went to college, started careers, and every time they came home they would ask him to tell the story. The one about the dog, the one about the wall, the one about the moment he thought he'd die and then heard scratching. And every time, Daniel would tell it. Not because he enjoyed reliving it, but because he knew the power of stories, the way they could shift perspectives, inspire action, remind people that even in the darkest places, hope could break through, and that sometimes hope had 4 legs and a wet nose. The mine never reopened. The land was eventually sold, the shafts sealed permanently. Wildflowers grew where rubble had once been. Trees reclaimed the perimeter. The town shrank as small towns do, but it didn't disappear. It adapted. New businesses emerged. A community center was built with funds from the lawsuit settlement. Scholarships were established for the children of the miners who died, and every year, on the anniversary of the quake, people would gather at the memorial wall. They would speak the names, light the candles, and they would remember, not just the loss, but the resilience, the way a community had come together, the way truth had emerged from darkness, the way one man's refusal to stay silent had sparked a revolution, and the way one dog's persistence had reminded everyone that no life, no matter how buried, no matter how forgotten, was beyond saving. Marcus began developing a new training protocol based on Flint's instincts. He called it persistence detection, teaching dogs not just to alert when they found something, but to remain engaged even when the target seemed impossible to reach. Traditional training focused on speed and accuracy. Marcus's approach added a third dimension, determination. He designed exercises where targets were placed behind increasingly difficult barriers, concrete walls, metal plates, layers of insulation. The goal wasn't just to find the target, but to refuse to move on until the handler investigated. He worked with younger dogs, watching as they learned to differentiate between nothing here and something here but I can't reach it. The difference was subtle, a shift in body language, a change in breathing pattern, a quality of focus that bordered on obsession. Other handlers were skeptical at first. "You're teaching them to false alert," one argued during a training seminar. Marcus shook his head. "I'm teaching them to trust their senses over our assumptions. There's a difference." He showed them video footage from the Greyridge rescue, the way Flint had frozen, the way his body had locked onto that section of wall, the way he'd refused to move even when Marcus tried to continue the search. "That's not a false alert," Marcus said. "That's certainty. And if we'd ignored it, Daniel would be dead." The room fell silent. One by one, handlers began adopting elements of the protocol. Within 2 years, it was being taught at regional training centers. Within 5, it was part of the national curriculum. And every time a dog using the method made a find that traditional training would have missed, Marcus thought of Flint, of the way he'd refused to accept that no one was behind that wall, of the way persistence had saved a life. An investigative journalist named Rebecca Chen became fascinated with the Greyridge case. She'd covered the initial disaster, but as the legal proceedings unfolded, she realized there was a deeper story. She spent months interviewing former miners, reviewing company documents, tracing the chain of decisions that had led to the collapse. What she uncovered was a pattern of negligence that stretched back years, inspections that were scheduled weeks in advance, giving companies time to make temporary fixes, regulators who accepted dinner invitations and golf outings from the executives they were supposed to oversee, whistleblowers who'd been quietly reassigned or let go before they could make formal complaints. Daniel wasn't the first person to recognize the danger. He was just the first one they couldn't silence permanently. Rebecca's investigation became a book. Buried Truth: How Corporate Greed and Regulatory Failure Killed 44 Men. It was a bestseller, won awards, sparked congressional hearings. But what Rebecca remembered most was her interview with Daniel. They'd met at his home, sat in the garden he'd built. He'd been quiet at first, hands moving absently through the soil as he spoke. When she asked him what he wanted people to understand, he'd looked up, eyes clear and direct. "I want them to know that speaking up is terrifying, that the pressure to stay silent is enormous, that you risk your job, your reputation, sometimes your safety, but I also want them to know that the alternative is worse. Because if I'd stayed silent, those 44 men would have died anyway, and their families would never have known why. At least now they have the truth, and the truth, no matter how painful, is better than a comfortable lie." Rebecca included that quote on the book's dedication page. Beneath it she added, "For Daniel Ortiz, who refused to be buried, and for Flint, who refused to stop digging." The story reached beyond national borders. Mining operations in South America, Africa, Asia began reviewing their own safety protocols, some proactively, others under pressure from workers emboldened by Daniel's example. A miners' union in Chile invited Daniel to speak at their annual conference. He hesitated. Public speaking still made him anxious, and the thought of flying terrified him. But Maria encouraged him. "Your story doesn't just belong to Greyridge," she said. "It belongs to every worker who's ever been afraid to speak up." So he went, stood on a stage in front of 3,000 miners, and told them what had happened, showed them the scars on his wrists, described the darkness, the hunger, the certainty that he'd been forgotten, and then he told them about the scratching, about the light breaking through, about the moment he realized someone had come. When he finished, the room was silent. Then, starting from the back, people stood, one by one, row by row, until the entire auditorium was on its feet, applauding. Some were crying. Daniel stood there overwhelmed until the union president came to the podium and embraced him. "You gave us courage," the president said in Spanish, his voice amplified by the microphone. "You showed us that silence protects only those who do harm, and you reminded us that we are not alone." The speech was translated into a dozen languages, shared on social media, became a rallying cry for labor movements worldwide. And Daniel, who'd spent days in darkness convinced he'd been erased from the world, became a symbol of resilience and resistance that transcended borders and industries. As Flint aged, Marcus adjusted their work schedule. Fewer long searches, more training demonstrations, the occasional public appearance where children could meet the famous rescue dog and learn about safety. Flint seemed content with the slower pace. His joints ached on cold mornings. His eyesight dimmed slightly, but the core of who he was remained unchanged. On the rare occasions when Marcus brought him to an active search site, Flint's body would come alive. The old focus would return, the intensity, the absolute certainty of purpose. Marcus always kept those visits brief, never pushing Flint beyond his limits, but he never stopped bringing him, because he understood that for a dog like Flint, the work wasn't just a job, it was identity, and to deny him that entirely would have been cruel. They developed new rituals, morning walks through the park, slow and meandering, afternoons on the porch, Flint lying in the sun while Marcus read incident reports, evenings by the fireplace, where Marcus would scratch behind Flint's ears and tell him stories about the people they'd helped, the lives they'd saved, the difference they'd made. Flint would watch him with those intelligent eyes, tail thumping softly against the floor, and Marcus would feel the weight of gratitude for the years they'd had, for the work they'd done, for the privilege of partnering with a being whose capacity for loyalty and determination exceeded anything human. When Flint's health finally began to decline, Marcus made the hardest decision of his career. He scheduled the appointment on a clear, warm afternoon, brought Flint to their favorite spot in the park, where they'd trained countless times, sat with him in the grass, fed him treats, told him he was a good boy, the best boy, that he'd done everything right, that he could rest now. The veterinarian came to them quiet and respectful, and as Flint drifted off, Marcus held him close, whispering thank yous into his fur, for the rescues, for the partnership, for showing the world what loyalty looked like, for refusing to give up when everyone else had stopped searching, for being exactly who he was supposed to be. Flint passed away at the age of 12, surrounded by Marcus and his family. It was peaceful, quiet. His body simply gave out, worn down by years of service, of searching, of giving everything he had to the mission. Marcus buried him in a small plot behind his house, beneath an oak tree that had stood for decades. He marked the grave with a simple stone: Flint, partner, hero, friend. And for a long time, he couldn't bring himself to get another dog. The house felt too empty, the silence too loud. But 6 months later, a colleague called. "We've got a pup, Malinois mix, smart as hell. Needs a handler." Marcus hesitated. Then he thought of Flint, of the way he'd refused to give up, of the way he'd taught Marcus that the work didn't stop just because the grief was heavy. "Bring him by," Marcus said. The pup was small, energetic, all paws and ears and boundless curiosity. Marcus knelt down. The pup bounded over, tail wagging, tongue out, and Marcus smiled, not because the pup was Flint, but because the pup carried the same spark, the same drive, the same instinct to search, to find, to save. Marcus clipped a leash to the pup's collar. "All right, kid," he said, "let's get to work." And somewhere in the space between memory and mission, Flint's legacy continued. In every search, every rescue, every life pulled from the edge of oblivion, because the work never ends. The calls keep coming, the disasters keep happening, and as long as there are people willing to search and dogs willing to dig, hope will always break through the walls we build around despair. That's the truth Flint taught the world, not through words, but through action, through the simple, stubborn refusal to let anyone be forgotten. And that lesson, like the scratch of claws against stone, echoes forever. Daniel Ortiz lived to see his daughters graduate from college, watched them start families of their own, held his grandchildren, and told them stories about courage and persistence, and a dog who wouldn't stop scratching. He continued his advocacy work well into his 60s, never losing the fire that had been forged in darkness and sealed behind stone. And every year, on the anniversary of his rescue, he would drive to the cemetery where Flint was buried. He would sit beneath the oak tree, place a hand on the stone, and whisper the same words he'd whispered that first day, when light broke through the wall and he realized he hadn't been forgotten. "Thank you. Thank you for finding me." The mountain still stands, the town still breathes, and somewhere in the quiet hours of the night when the wind moves through the valley and the stars press close, you can hear it, the sound of a dog's claws against stone, the sound of a man's tears turning into hope, the sound of a truth too powerful to stay buried. That sound is what rescue really means. Not the moment of extraction, but the moment when someone realizes they were never forgotten, that someone kept searching, that someone refused to let them disappear. And in that moment, the darkness loses. Every single time,